In the summer of 1914, the world looked more connected than it had ever been. Trade was booming, telegraphs linked continents. Educated people in London and Vienna genuinely believed large-scale war had become too expensive and too irrational to happen. 37 million people died in the next 4 years. Right now, there are active artillery exchanges in Ukraine, drone strikes across the Middle East, and naval standoffs in the South China Sea. A poll conducted across the US, UK, Canada, and France found that a plurality of respondents believe a world war is more likely than not within the next 5 years. Not a fringe opinion, a plurality. So your brain is doing something with that information. It's pulling the 1914 file, running the pattern, and arriving at the worst outcome it knows. That's not anxiety disorder. That's your threat detection system working exactly as designed, just without the right data to process. This video is going to give it the right data. There's a 4-variable framework called CAGE that actually measures escalation risk. Not what the headlines are doing, not what any single commentator thinks, but the structural pressure on the system itself. Every variable changes how you read what's happening in the world right now. Skip one, and you're still just reacting to noise.
The 1914 pattern your brain keeps loading looks like this. One assassination, one ultimatum, one alliance calls in another, and 6 weeks later, all of Europe is at war. The cascade felt like physics. One domino fell, and the rest had no choice. That's the trap. Because your brain doesn't just remember the outcome, it memorizes the mechanism. So the moment you see 2 major powers exchanging strikes anywhere on Earth, the 1914 file opens automatically, and the cascade starts playing. That's not stupidity. That's survival wiring built for a world that no longer has the same architecture. Margaret Macmillan, who spent her career studying international history at Oxford and the University of Toronto, makes a point worth sitting with. World War I wasn't the result of careful planning. Nobody designed it. What caused it was pride, misread signals, and leaders who reached a point where backing down felt more dangerous to their personal standing than escalating. The war happened because enough people in enough rooms felt they couldn't afford to look weak. That specific failure mode, pride overriding calculation, is still live. We'll come back to it hard in a few minutes because it's the most dangerous variable in the whole system. But first, the structural difference that most people miss entirely. The 1914 system was dominoes. The architecture itself transmitted force. One alliance obligation triggered the next, mechanically, with almost no friction. The post-1945 system was built by people who had watched that happen and decided to engineer against it. NATO's Article 5 isn't a hair trigger that pulls every member into war automatically. It's a defensive tripwire designed to stop the first domino from falling, not carry the chain forward. That's a fundamentally different piece of machinery. The Marshall Plan spent over $12 billion, roughly $150 billion in today's money, not just to rebuild Europe, but to fuse former enemies into a single economic system so thoroughly interlocked that attacking each other would mean dismantling their own prosperity. The circuit breakers were built in deliberately. Most people see smoke and assume fire. The sharper question is what the smoke detector is made of and whether it's still working. That's exactly what the CAGE framework measures.
CAGE stands for 4 variables: conflict spread, alliance stress, gray zone escalation, and economic tripwires. Each one is a separate instrument. Together, they give you a reading of how much pressure the system is actually under, which is a different question from whether any single conflict is frightening. C is conflict spread. Multiple active wars running simultaneously is real and it's serious, but spread alone does not equal world war. The critical question isn't how many fires are burning, it's whether the fires are merging. Right now, Ukraine and the Middle East and the South China Sea are all generating heat, but their perimeters haven't connected into a single front. Simultaneous regional conflicts actually function as a release valve, giving major powers a theater to compete and signal without forcing direct confrontation between them. The US and Russia are both involved in adjacent conflicts. Neither has directly engaged the other's military. That gap is not an accident. It's both sides running the same calculation about what crossing it would cost. Conflict spread is currently high. High is not world war. It's elevated risk that demands attention, not capitulation to the worst scenario. A is alliance stress. New defense pacts are forming across the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, and Europe. On the surface, that looks like 1914's web of mutual obligations rebuilding itself. But there's a structural difference that most comparisons ignore. The pre-1914 alliances were built primarily from military leverage. The post-1945 alliance system was built on economic integration first, security second. Germany and France went from destroying each other twice in 30 years to becoming anchor partners in the same economic union because the Marshall Plan made their recoveries dependent on each other. The alliances forming now are doing so on top of that economic substrate, which changes how they behave under pressure. Alliance stress is elevated. The fraying is real, but the economic threads running underneath are still holding the structure together.
G is gray zone escalation. Cyber attacks, disinformation, proxy warfare, sabotage. The gray zone is constantly active, and people read it as a countdown clock to open war. It's actually closer to the opposite. Every time a major power chooses a cyber operation over an airstrike or funds a proxy instead of deploying its own forces, it's making an implicit admission. Crossing into declared war would collapse too much too fast. The gray zone isn't the path to World War III, it's the alternative to World War III. Expensive, destabilizing, corrosive in ways we'll come back to, but still operating below the threshold that triggers the machinery. Gray zone activity is extremely active. That's the pressure finding its outlet. E is economic tripwires. Capital in New York connects to manufacturing in Shenzhen, connects to energy markets in the Gulf through supply chains that took decades to build. Severing those threads wouldn't just hurt an enemy, it would hollow out your own economy before the first week was over. Every major power's treasury and defense ministry runs that calculation. The number comes back bad every time, and that bad number functions as a permanent brake on escalation between powers with genuine economic exposure to each other. Economic tripwires are holding, not because anyone is feeling generous, but because the math is brutal in both directions. So, the current cage reading, conflict spread high, alliance stress elevated, gray zone extremely active, economic tripwires holding. The system is under real pressure. The circuit breakers are still engaged. But every single one of those frameworks carries a buried assumption that the person sitting closest to the most consequential decisions is running a rational cost-benefit calculation. And the research on that assumption should make you pause.
Every model we just walked through, deterrence theory, economic interdependence, the alliance architecture, runs on the same hidden assumption, that the person closest to the decision is processing it like a spreadsheet. Cost on one side, benefits on the other, rational actor produces rational output. The research says that assumption is dangerously incomplete, and the incompleteness isn't a minor footnote, it's the whole ballgame. Researchers who studied leaders at the center of three major Cold War crises, Suez in 1956, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and the Yom Kippur War in 1973, generated psychological trait estimates for 13 of the key decision-makers involved. What they found wasn't that one side had dangerous personalities and the other didn't. The destabilizing traits appeared across ideologies, across political systems, across every kind of regime. Several leaders with what researchers categorized as high dominance accentuations repeatedly amplified escalation risk during those crises, not because they were strategically committed to escalation, but because of how their psychology processed the specific feeling of being challenged. That matters enormously because it means the danger isn't located in any particular country or any particular government. It's a recurring feature of how certain personality structures respond to a very specific set of conditions: genuine threat, public humiliation, and the perception that backing down means being destroyed. Here's what actually happens inside a leader's decision-making process during a real crisis. Stress hormones flood the system fast. Cognitive bandwidth narrows. The capacity for long-horizon thinking, what does this look like in 6 months? What does this do to my economy? What does history say about wars that started this way? Starts competing with something far more immediate and far more emotionally loaded. The insult, the loss of face, the visceral sense that yielding is not a strategic choice but a personal annihilation. At that point, the nation stops being a country to govern and starts feeling like an extension of the self. An attack on its prestige registers as an attack on the person. De-escalation stops reading as wisdom and starts reading as surrender. And surrendering, for someone whose entire psychological architecture is built around dominance, doesn't feel like a policy option, it feels like dying. Humiliated people don't run spreadsheets. They look for ways to stop feeling humiliated.
The Able Archer crisis of 1983 is the sharpest illustration of how close this gets. NATO ran a military exercise. Soviet leadership had been briefed. They knew it was a drill, but somewhere in the process of watching NATO rehearse nuclear strike coordination, Soviet leadership convinced themselves the exercise was cover for a real first strike and began preparing a response. The machinery of retaliation started moving, not because of a weapon malfunctioning or a border being crossed, but because of a psychological misread under pressure. What stopped it wasn't a treaty. It wasn't a defense system. Reagan and Thatcher appeared in public. Ambassadors delivered direct reassurances through back channels. Someone made a phone call. The off-ramp existed, and there were enough people on both sides with enough psychological grip to take it. That sentence carries the whole weight of where we actually are right now. Modern crisis management has more tools for creating those off-ramps than existed at any previous point in history. Back channels, diplomatic frameworks, military hotlines designed specifically to prevent misread exercises from becoming launches. Those tools are genuinely better than they were in 1983. But every single one of them requires something that no technology can manufacture and no treaty can guarantee. The person on the other end has to have enough psychological capacity to pick up the phone. Not enough intelligence, not enough information. Enough psychological capacity, meaning enough separation between their personal identity and the outcome of the crisis that de-escalation can actually register as an option rather than a self-erasure. When that capacity exists, the system holds. When it doesn't, all the circuit breakers we built matter far less than we need them to. There is one more layer underneath all of this, though, that almost nobody is talking about, and it's the one moving the slowest, which is exactly why it's the most dangerous.
The real danger in the current environment doesn't arrive with a decoration. It doesn't show up on a radar screen. It moves like rust, invisible until the structure it's eating through finally gives way. The technical term is threshold drift, and it works like this. A gray zone action happens, a cyber attack on civilian infrastructure, a proxy force crossing a line nobody officially acknowledged existed, a disinformation campaign that looks like domestic politics. Nothing happens in response, not because anyone decided it wasn't serious, but because responding openly would require escalating past the gray zone, and the cost of doing that is too high. So the action goes formally unanswered. The aggressor registers that. The next action lands a little further forward. That one goes unanswered too. The line hasn't moved in any dramatic, publicly visible way, but it has moved, and over enough iterations it ends up somewhere that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier, and nobody called a press conference to announce when crossing it became acceptable. This is different from the escalation risks we've already covered, because it doesn't require a crisis moment. It doesn't require a psychology breaking under pressure, or an alliance obligation getting triggered. It just requires patience and the slow accumulation of small decisions that individually look manageable. There's a second layer to this that compounds the first one. The post-1945 order wasn't only held together by military architecture and economic threading. It ran on something harder to measure, a shared enough belief that the rules meant something, that international law carried weight, that institutional responses, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, collective statements, had consequences an aggressor would actually calculate. Once that belief erodes in enough places, the whole deterrence ecosystem starts losing traction. Sanctions require buy-in to bite. Back channels require trust to function. Deterrence requires a target who believes the threat is real. Strip the credibility out of the system gradually, and the formal structures remain while the substance drains out of them. Disinformation accelerates this directly. A campaign designed to fracture a society's shared version of reality doesn't need anyone to believe anything specific. It just needs enough people uncertain enough that collective decision-making slows down, turns inward, loses coherence. A society genuinely turned against itself can't mount a coherent response to an external threat. That's not a side effect, that's the mechanism. So the paradox we're actually living inside looks like this. To avoid catastrophic war, we've tolerated permanent low-grade conflict, the fever instead of the explosion, and a permanent fever has a way of becoming the new baseline, right up until it isn't. Your anxiety about all of this isn't irrational, it's information. It's your brain registering that something structural is shifting and asking correctly for a framework that can actually process what's happening instead of just generating fear.
World War III is not a destiny. Every structural factor we've looked at, the circuit breakers built into the post-1945 architecture, the economic costs that make major power war a losing calculation before it starts, the off-ramps that still exist and still get taken, all of it points the same direction. Rational actors under pressure choose managed competition over mutual destruction. That's held for 80 years. 3 things worth carrying out of this. Read systems, not headlines. A single alarming event means almost nothing without the structural context around it. Recognize that the real battlefield in modern conflict is psychological, which means your own thinking is either an asset or a liability depending on how well you've trained it. And build the capacity to stay clear when the pressure is highest, because that's exactly when it matters most. The same brain that catastrophizes under pressure becomes your sharpest instrument when it's been given the right frameworks and the discipline to use them. That's what this channel documents, how to build that kind of thinking. If that's useful to you, subscribe. There's more coming. The world is designed to keep you afraid. A mind that reads clearly is the only real defense against that.